Raven here again. Well, thank you again for staying or coming if you're just arriving. I'm one half of Brown Girls Museum Blog. My other half is over there, Amanda. We're Brown Girls Museum Blog. We're here with DCPL to do this amazing, free, and open access program to prove that communities of color and communities in general are interested in their libraries and being a part of that dialogue. So I was going to introduce everybody, but I feel like you all should do it in your own words. But also if you want to say the short version of what you do, because they all do amazing things, but we got an hour. So very short, like 3 sentences of what you do. And then also if you have any pronouns that you would like to be addressed by. So I'm she and hers.
Hello. My name is Allison Bashai. In respect of time, I will give the abbreviated version as requested. I am the founder and curator of Resource Library, which is just a handful of blocks away from here near Union Market. And Resource is a design library shop and event series. It is a third space, if you will. All of the books and magazines are related to design somehow, and they're free to read and use within the space. We don't do checking out like a traditional library, so we are more of a reading room, if you will. But to Raven's point, it's a pop-up to kind of create some proof of concept around the idea of non-consumer spaces, and then also community centered around design.
Hello, everyone. The weather's amazing. Just wanted to shout out God. Okay. My name is Desiree Van Frederick. There's an odd echo. Did you experience that? Yeah. Okay. My name is Desiree Van Frederick, and I am a Trinidad resident. I am many things, but ultimately I love oral history. I love folklore. I explore and collect Black ephemera from across the diaspora, and my work is primarily centered around building community through economic equity and doing that through independent retail.
Hey everybody, my name is Mary Ann James Daly. I am my title probably would take up all my time. I'm an assistant director of public services at DC Public Library for the Central Library for MLK. And that's that big building downtown that's going through our big modernization. Very excited. And before that, I was manager of the labs, which I'm a big fan of what's going on back behind us. And yeah, I love public libraries.
Hi everyone, I'm Nicole Ivy. I am a professor of American Studies at the George Washington University. I'm also a historian. I have worked as director of inclusion for the American Alliance of Museums, and I'm interested in archives because I'm a writer and researcher, and I work on 19th century Black women and visual culture.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dulcina Abreu. I'm an artist and a curatorial assistant in the Smithsonian National Postal Museum. And I am here today because my practice as a creator and as an artist, it's very tied to the archives. And as a Dominican and as a Latinx artist, I'm always advocating to have more documents and to understand what is to be visible, not only in contemporary art, but in writing. And this is why I'm here today.
You guys can clap. All right, well, that's everybody who is joining us today for the conversation. And of course, near the end, we want to have a Q&A, so feel free to join the conversation with us. So my first question for you ladies, and jumping right in, how do you define librarianship and how is it evolving in its definition? And this can be for yourself, it's not about Webster.
I was like, I guess being the librarian here, I'll start out with that. When I was thinking about this, I think my drumbeat is access. That's what being a librarian is about. And it's evolved. I think it's always been about access, but it's evolved from let's have a building full of books that have been decided upon by one person or one viewpoint to let's, yes, have lots of books, but have it informed by the community that we serve. And let's also have programs and services that help the community that's there. What do they need? I think especially public libraries, we're now at the point where we are really community informed. What do the people in our neighborhood need? Whether it's Mount Pleasant or Northeast. I'm naming all of our libraries. I won't name all of our libraries. But the point is that we are really evolving to, at least as far as public libraries are, to serve the communities that are there. And it becomes more of a conversation rather than us sitting and saying, here is what you need. We have that continual feedback between the communities.
I wanted to continue what you were when you were mentioning that the libraries are focused on what the public needs, and I think one of the most amazing initiatives that I seen as public is that DC Public Library started to think about what is this service for, okay, we're giving you content, but what are you doing with this? And this is why Fab Lab started, because not only necessarily you're going to write about what you're reading, but necessary for artists and another at least for people that are more interested in craft, how these translation in between reading towards another mediums is facilitated by this library, by these spaces that are not necessarily closing these barrier of translation.
Oh, just co-signing on that. Yes, we are doing a great job of that. Yeah. One of the things I'll say that when I was manager of the labs, that was the constant drumbeat or the message that we were giving, and I think it translates across other things that we're doing. I can think of our outreach department, and I can think of individual librarians at other branches. One thing that we have with the labs is that we have a maker in residence, and I remember the first time we had a maker in residence where through our foundation we give an artist a stipend and they would explore what's going on in our maker space and our studio space and use materials in the collection to create that, to find out, to bridge between the artist world and the library. And one thing I remember, we were in the lab, it was still at MLK, and the artist in residence there, he had found some old, it probably was a dusty book, something that somebody had not cracked open in a long time, and he was creating, it had an old trebuchet, and so then from that he was able to make his own interpretation of a trebuchet. I mean, it's kind of random it seems, but still, it's he found that interesting and was able to bridge something that was long forgotten on a shelf and did that. I think as far as a Black woman and as a woman of color, I appreciate having these spaces that we're providing and that we're also going out into the communities where people are, because we also need to be represented, and a lot of times we don't have access to the things that other people may. So the library is that equalizer. We can provide laser cutters and 3D printers, or even just the information on how you can do a basic craft so that you can tell your story.
I'll contribute in the sense that the private sector is going through a very similar transition of trying to identify what it means to build community. And so, for example, your favorite multinational independent retailer is now developing experiential spaces and communities in order to connect to consumers like you and to essentially build into other aspects of your life beyond a transactional exchange, right? Beyond you purchasing a garment and giving them money for that. And our public services are very much going through that very similar transition. And although we've had this idea that public has always been open to everyone or accessible to everyone, that I hope that no one thinks that or believes that historically. And so it's only now that we see a true intentional, and largely because of people like you sitting in positions like you do, to suggest and to impart, a new way, right? There are a new pathways being developed. And so what the public has, or private sector has long understood, and what it's now evolving to really kind of provide, through peer-to-peer production and, collaborative pop-up spaces or, collective experiences. Public is also going through a very similar transition, and the idea there is the two sectors have to communicate what that looks like for the future of communities, because they've so long been siloed. We've identified the challenges and problems and really why that's been problematic historically. And now, as we're moving into this new environment, what does collaborative conversation look like between private and public?
I don't have a background in public library or a similar organization or institution, so my contribution will be a little bit more broad and less specific. But to me, or in my opinion, a librarian or librarianship is a service around a resource, a public resource, if you will. And traditionally, we think of that resource as books or maps that are in a library, and a librarian's job is to procure and catalog and provide assistance around that resource. And I think the way that the term is evolving is that the resource isn't just only books. It's a lot of the examples that these ladies gave, and we're diving deeper into what that a public resource might be.
So what has been your role as a keeper of community and memory that you see so far in the work that you've been doing?
My role is incredibly personal, because in collecting, researching, archiving, documenting, and then providing access to history, I find myself and I see myself reflected. So it's only in those spaces and in my work over the course of the last 14 years that I've actually been able to see myself in full breath, not in kind of just slithers of what my historical experience would have been, was, and thereby what my current value and kind of position in this world is. And so my world of collecting stories, through objects. I'm a vintage collector, and I seek, a myriad of stories in those goods. And those goods have allowed me to then bring in to highlight and then amplify stories that are long forgotten or overlooked, and to bring people into those conversations so that ultimately these, the dialogue can be broadened beyond one perspective or, again, one narrator, which is what we were accustomed to. Growing up, I immigrated to this country at age 7, and one of the things that I found very familiar when I moved to Montgomery County, Maryland, because at the time we were living in Cairo, and I moved to Montgomery County, Maryland, and nothing was familiar. Imagine that that geographical difference. But going into a public library was a point of familiarity, because it was something that I did in every other country I'd lived in. And, being able to build relationships with librarians who became friends. I mean, I was the little girl who was friends with 40, 50-year-old women. It gave me the opportunity to see that this country was really no different from any other country I'd lived in. And it gave me the opportunity to actually broaden my purview and my perspective of what America was. And, to see that it wasn't this monolith that I'd been told and through the books I'd read of white people. And I was like, oh, wait, there are people who look like me, and there are people who look like every one of you here and have been here from time immemorial. And so the idea of being able to access objects books, literature, and also thought, right? Which is really what public spaces allow us to engage, which is each other's thoughts and perspectives, which then complicates what we pull from books and archives, right? And so the idea of just having these goods accessible and being able to collect them and being able to make them accessible to as many people as possible is something that perhaps is now being commercialized. But it's something that's long existed. It isn't new in any way, shape, or form.
I am not an archivist, but I did talk to an archivist before I came here. Our head of special collections is also a black woman, and I was like, hey, Carrie, her name is Carrie Cotton Williams. I was like, hey, Carrie, I need to talk to you just so I get your perspective. And she was saying that as an archivist, particularly working at the library, at the public library, is that now, archives are about connecting communities. Back as you were saying, going from there is this monolith, the way we get away from that is by connecting with the communities and getting their stuff back. And especially as a public library, it's all about public service. So yeah, one cool thing that she did mention was that with MLK, we are redoing MLK. We're doing a full, did I mention a full-scale modernization? He's excited about MLK. 2020, y'all, it'll be open. Come visit. And one thing that we're doing is that we will have exhibit space there, and as part of that work, Carrie and her team are reaching out to churches in the area because we are creating exhibits around the namesake, around MLK. What does that mean? And particularly for DC. So yeah, as far as librarianship evolving, but also where archives are, it's about going to the community, and hopefully in that we'll be able to take some of the stuff from there, have it on loan so that we can share and expand access to those stories.
Thank you. So my role as a keeper of community and memory, I guess, is also very personal because I have been kept by community. And my memories of the community that kept me are what propelled me as a writer, as a teacher, as an institution builder. I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. We brought you A. Philip Randolph, James Weldon Johnson, 95 South, who also brought you Whoomp, There It Is. And speaking of memory and community. And I grew up right around the corner from a library, the Dallas J. Graham branch of the Jacksonville, Florida Public Library. And it was a place where my sister and I would go after school for childcare. I had working parents. My mom and dad couldn't always pick us up, so we would catch the school bus to the local tiny branch of the library. And that was where I spent every day after school. And that's where I learned to be inquisitive. That's where I learned to ask questions. I had my first fight in a library, for real. So it was a place of community, but also a place where I learned how to be a human in the world, how I learned to interact with other people. And as a person who thinks a lot about the past and works with other museum professionals and scholars and writers to think about how we practice the past in public, libraries have really shaped how I do that. They've become my model for how we think about the past in public. And so community and memory are important to me because I've lived a lot of places. And part of how I stay sane in the world is by understanding a place. And understanding the stories of that place and trying to honor them through the written word. So.
I think because we are all women of color and we are all the time doing our own way and finding our way to shape our careers to create more visibility. I think everybody has taken their own moment to think what I can do to create more content, to create a space that not necessarily we are going to find, but how can I find and take it back. So when you were mentioning about your experience, to you, your experience like with the library. I remember like I didn't have like a good experience like growing up in libraries because everything was like very exclusive. Everybody was like Eurocentric, or the masters were not local. And at some point, I think like this is why I decided to leave Dominican Republic, and I started to like look for spaces to study, to create, or like understand how we can start to collecting our own study, crafting, and having like all these like stories that maybe were not in written, but they were all oral stories, how to translate this, that maybe because of language barriers, they were not in history. And my first experience like in an institution that was like archiving or having this mission was with American history, and I was doing like an internship over there with collecting initiative for Latinos in baseball, and they were like going to the communities and collecting from their like families in the West Coast, in New York, and like this idea that people were in power of like what is in history, what we can like archive, and creating like a space is not necessary for our own communities, but like all the communities that were in how can I say, marginalized, that were with the tag that not necessarily that was like intellectual material, and I think that this was like very important for me to like see that other people were already in the labor of creating an entrance for more material with our stories.
I'm actually very happy to be able to follow Dulcina because of her mention of exclusivity, and that was one of the reasons why I was inspired to start a space like Resource that's centered around design print, because I wanted to kind of break down this barrier that design is something that is very exclusive. Design print is very expensive to begin with, and so having a place where it can be free and accessible to anyone was the inspiration for the space, but then also removing this idea that design is something that's very esoteric and only for a certain type of person, and that it refers to only interior design or architecture, and that design is streets and signs and literally all around us. And so from an accessibility standpoint, the print being free, of course, but then also that design itself is accessible. And so I think in terms of keeper of community, I think that's for me still in progress. I also don't have a wonderful memory of libraries as a child, because it was where my working parents would tell me to go after school, and I would pretend that I was there and not be there and be out with my friends. And so it was like this place that I was sort of like sentenced to after school every day. And it's interesting to see how as an adult I've kind of come around to a completely side of my feelings about libraries. So I did not remember that memory until just now.
That's why we're here, citation and memory. No, this is important. So access, exclusivity, right? And then you were talking, Desiree, about the private sector. So my next question, don't know if everybody heard about this. Oh, no, I'll stand over here. Earlier this summer, Forbes published an op-ed titled "Amazon Should Replace Local Libraries to Save Taxpayers Money." And so part of their argument was that Starbucks is a similar model of success. And so, of course, I want to know what your thoughts are as we consider first the ways in which people of color, particularly black folks, are not permitted to occupy such spaces, right? And secondly, Amazon and the boom of this faceless service industry. If we think about Uber Eats and things like that, right? Like, we're not as attentive as we were to who is actually making our things and how we got them and things of that nature. So whoever would like to start that loaded question.
Specifically about Amazon, and I think when I think of Amazon, I think about like the free next day delivery and Amazon Prime Now, and just kind of like the accessibility of how quick you can get something. And from a different industry, I think it was a piece of, I don't remember if it was in the Washington Post or it was a local publication about local stores closing, and one of the stores was a furniture store, and they said that people will come in and take pictures of things, and then they'll later or sometimes stand in the store and buy it on Amazon or elsewhere on their phone, and they would have never found this rug or mirror or whatever it was if this store wasn't local. But they're getting it for a little bit cheaper online, and they're using this store as a showroom, but they make no money off of it. And I think people do that with books all the time. I've seen people take pictures of books at Busboys and Poets or Politics of Prose, and then they later go and buy it. And if they weren't in that store, they may never have found out about that item. And I think that there isn't enough value around the person, a librarian, if you will, who in that sense is not the right term because it's commerce, but the person who is skilled enough to find those items and put them together for you and expose you to that information. There's no value of that person when you go and buy it online. And so I don't know that I think of it as a faceless service industry, more as a marketplace that's taking away from something local. But I personally see more and more people, at least in my circle, I don't know if that's a good representation, where people are like, no, I want to buy this from this place because it's local, or I develop film at this local camera shop because it's local, and I want to make sure that it's there. And the consciousness of, if I don't support this, it will leave. And I think that may come from other places closing and people realizing that they can have a part in that.
Yes to everything she said. Shop local. So I would approach this in a couple of different ways. First, Amazon is the second U.S.-based company to reach the $1 trillion mark, second to Apple. That has occurred very recently. So Amazon is huge. Amazon is also not going away. In my work, I'm constantly trying to negotiate what it means for a multinational $1 trillion company like Amazon to coexist in the world with other multinational companies, but also in the ecosystem of independent businesses, right? And we understand, as she alluded, the value of an independent business. They're your neighbor who literally could sustain as your neighbor because they operate a small shop, coffee shop, bookstore, clothing store, vintage store, whatever it is, pet store, pet supply store. And they're able to sustain as your neighbor because they operate and generate revenue from that space. And they're able to educate their children, feed their pups, contribute to local nonprofits, contribute to the local schools, contribute to the ecosystem of a community, and also, actively, potentially employ you or your child or your cousin or your nephew who is seeking employment. There's incredible value, and I can go on and go on about the importance of independent retail. I don't view Amazon as this big bad monster because the reality is there are companies that have the opportunity to scale to that level. We're quite often left out of those opportunities, however, and that's the only thing that's what I would criticize. Bezos is a smart man. His history is lengthy. The idea that an Amazon takes money out of local communities is only a reality because your neighbors, us, we don't see the value in our local community. And we view this idea of quick and fast and kind of denote that as access, when in fact it disenfranchises a lot of people, yourself included. So there's always a negotiation when you're talking about access and whose access, who are you gaining access to? What are you gaining access to? And who are you creating a barrier for? And so that's something that we all have to critically analyze every time we hop on. And because it provides next day shipping or 2-hour delivery, which is now a thing, right, with lockers, you now have to kind of self-analyze. And I won't deny it. I purchase from Amazon from time to time because sometimes that's just the viable option. But I can't say that it accounts for even 5% of my purchases annually, because I would rather put some sweats on, the only pair I own, and walk down the street to pick up something, even if it's a bit of an inconvenience to have to get dressed and leave my house or whatever it may be. So that's something that we're responsible for. My second point of this is the idea that, one of the reasons I collect is not because, it's largely because I gravitate toward these things and the histories, but largely because I understand that even museums are private institutions, right? And museums are largely operated and organized and managed, and the net assets of the Smithsonian is well over $5 billion, if it were a private institution, right? And this idea that these goods, I consider myself killmonger when I'm finding museum quality goods and I'm keeping them in the community and reclaiming them. I don't agree with Killmonger in every aspect. So let me clarify that. Just in the sense of reclaiming what is ours. And so, I collect museum quality items. And I dig deep to ensure that I can preserve those goods and I can, again, make them accessible to us without having to go into a traditionally European institution who then gets to recount our story in a way that suits their narrative. And so the idea there is that private institutions and public institutions, again, in a capitalist world, are money driven. Let's not get it twisted. The Smithsonian is money driven, right? And even our public libraries have to sustain a budget, right? They don't exist without capital, without money, without the budget. And so it's just this constant negotiation that each of us have to make when we're making decisions of where we acquire goods, where we lend, loan, and borrow, and where, of course, we're spending our dollars, but more importantly, where we're directing our energy, which is our time.
Again, agree with a lot of what's going on, what's been said. I think one thing that I was thinking of as far as the nameless economy, Sears this week filed for bankruptcy, and I remember reading a story this week about how having Sears actually helped people of color because they had that faceless catalog model, because I hope I won't butcher the thesis or the idea of this article, but basically, before then, people of color, black people, you go to the general store, the person in the general store was often a white person who likely did not want to serve you. That was that access point right there. And Sears, having a catalog where you would order and then they would send it, made them able to be able to get the things that they needed and the things that they wanted. So yeah, exactly. And they price gouge, exactly. So I think, there's always a little bit of a gray. There's not black and white. I think also Amazon, I'm not going to say is an evil, horrible corporation. I also use it probably a little bit more than you say you do, but I'm also have 2 kids and I'm trying to make it work, right? But I think something, and perhaps this is a little bit Pollyanna or naive, I think this is, or it just powers me, is that it's about gaining access. It's about us being represented in and having the opportunity to create those to be the next Amazon or the next, Uber Eats, whatever you want to call it. Because, and actually I'm thinking of Asia who's sitting out there, I was listening to this podcast about this woman who is a black woman, VC. Her goal was to be a VC, a venture capitalist. She moved to Silicon Valley, slept in her car, all this sort of stuff, so that she could build up capital. And it's been a very hard road for her because she is a black woman, right? But her goal is to fund companies for people that look like her, that are black, that are women, that are queer. And to bring it back to the library, that's my thought with the library. That's my thought of what our role is to, one, plant those seeds with the young kids here, the kids who are at the art lab, the kids to come into the labs, the kids that go to the studio lab to plant those seeds and to give them the support that they need so that they can build their own things. And if we can continue as the community ourselves to build that up, that then they hopefully come back because, yeah, we need money too. We need to pay for this. We need to pay for our staff. By them building and supporting them and they become successful, they can bring the money back in and we can be more self-sufficient.
I was going to say the Sears thing. So now I'm just going to talk randomly. What was it? I'm not going to do an interpretive dance. We have some dancers already, so I'm going to not do that. I'm just going to sit here. But the thing about Sears that did strike me was I was listening to NPR, and they used this word that I have never heard before called monopsony, and that is MONOPSONY, monopsony. And whereas monopoly means there's only one seller, monopsony means that there's only one buyer. And so they use the example of Amazon and Walmart as a way to talk about how these larger organizations, these larger businesses become the primary buyers, and we're sort of the secondary buyers of consumer goods. And the power of a primary buyer in the condition of monopsony means that they are the ones who are ultimately setting the price of the goods. So Walmart has a cap, but not a ceiling, but not really a floor, right? For like how low they want the price to be. And so I thought about that, when you talked about Amazon, thinking about what it means for all of our buying activities to be guided or set by someone who is not looking for competitive prices because they're not necessarily looking to pay competitive wages. But thinking about what does it mean when the buying power in this country is directed by an organization that is looking for the lowest floor. And so that to me is counter to visions of an equitable world that I inherited from the people at Dallas J. Graham Library. And so I guess I would say the two, I struggle with capitalism. I mean, I buy stuff, but I still struggle with it because I think the historian in me wants to underline the fact that capitalism is not inevitable. It's not the only system of exchange or human valuation that there has ever been. It's not a given that it has to exist in the same way that it exists now. And so what does that mean? I mean, I'm not a tech person. People talk about the way that Bitcoin is affecting how we understand global capital. I don't know all the specifics. I won't get into that. But what I will say is I think there's a model of public collaboration that involves exchange, that involves commerce, that doesn't necessarily have to look like monopsony or monopoly. There are models of collaboration that are built on the same kinds of publicness that we all are invested in. And those models of shared economic collaboration or that kind of shared economic policy doesn't necessarily have to be harmful. It can involve some principles that are humane. And so my interest is how do we make some of that happen? The last thing I'll say is I think there's this real push around nonprofit organizations to make sure that board members are people who have a kind of ethical, political commitment to, I don't want to say diversity, but to equity. And so I think that's one example of a move where money, or a money move, shout out to St. Cardi, where money can move in a way that might support radical, thoughtful, inclusive work on a humane scale. So I don't think that commerce always has to be in an inhumane scale. I think when we talk about scalability and use the terms that Amazon sets up, that might be good for Amazon, but it's not necessarily the best set of terms, especially for the nonprofit sector, like especially for things like museums, libraries, colleges, and universities. When we start, budgeting is one thing, but like maximizing our ROI, is a whole other thing, right? This idea of like what we do needs to maximize return on investment. The question becomes, what is the investment and what is the return? So I don't know. I'm not completely against commerce. Like I said, I buy stuff. I bought parking. I bought all these items. But I do wonder about other ways that we have seen where people share value, share exchange, share money in ways that aren't just about exploitation. So
I really like the remark that you did about investment and return, especially like everybody was like mostly like talking about like big enterprises, but like I was like, meanwhile I was hearing everybody, I was thinking about my experience going to libraries or going to bookstores and what I'm waiting to gain from, and what is like the difference in between like getting it from Amazon or getting it from a bookstore. And I was having this conversation with Allison because like I'm very in love with resource, and it's like my actual resource right now of like inspirations with all the books that are over there. But it gives me like a little trick on not objectifying the book, not objectifying the resource, to getting the information, but this object belongs there and is for more people, not only me. And in the moment that I acquire something, it not necessarily means that I'm away from capitalism, and that idea of like giving maybe like $3 more to a bookstore, local bookstore that is creating a list of books for me, that knows that I'm an artist, that is not what is the name of like the program that gives you like more of the same if you buy a book of art, algorithm? That is not an algorithm, that is a librarian or is an owner of a bookstore that takes time to see who are their public, that sits down and order books in order for you to like go and find these jewels. I think like at some point I have this in between. Yes, I'm going to like spend these $5 extras in like supporting this local bookstore, but at the same time thinking why I'm doing like when I'm acquiring this object, why I'm looking at information, and at the same time like keeping that question open and continuing with like the question of like product placement and philanthropy. For example, like Allison is doing this initiative and she's not selling books. The books are over there, and like who else is going to sponsoring this initiative is a philanthropist. It's not waiting for anything back. And at some point I was like, ooh, this exists. Yes, it exists, but like we need to like be looking for it more and more, because at some point, yes, we want to like contribute with our economy in terms of community, but at some point, like I feel like we are going away philanthropy and thinking that maybe we are not going to find those spaces, me included. I was surprised, but it exists, and I just think like we can like move even away from capitalism if we like nurture these like questions.
I
just wanted to add something about monopsony, which I did not know the term, which jogged my memory actually from an episode of Chef's Table in the last season. The Thai woman, I can't remember her name, and she made a comment about people in Thailand don't make their own curry anymore. They buy curry paste in a jar, and she said if we don't make or buy homemade curry paste, then it'll become industrialized and we'll only be able to get it from this one source. And I think that when you talk about monopsony, it's not just about the price floor or ceiling, it's also about choice. Like if every local bookstore goes out of business and we can only buy books on Amazon, then we're limited to the books that Amazon's willing to sell us. And we no longer have a choice of books or produce or meat, like to know where it comes from. It's like you buy it from Amazon and Amazon gives it to you, and you don't know where it's coming from. So not to get too deep into futurism, but another point on monopsony.
What was your question? Meals on Wheels in regards to... Can I ask one more question and then we'll open it up to the public? Thank you. Okay, so this is my last question. We actually are going to turn into the future. So what do you envision for the future of libraries, and what do you see as the role of women of color in this future? And I'm going to ask you to keep this answer as short as possible, but I know it's not fair, so I'm really sorry. But I also want to see questions so we can get...
My ideal future, as I envision what a library becomes, is that individuals develop their own and cultivate their own family histories and thereby document their own ancestral lineage for themselves, and actually, practice archiving, and, there are many resources that allow that. And so it's really, it's no longer leaving things up for institutions to establish for you, but it's taking that upon yourself and, requiring a few extra minutes of your time and hours of your life, but then having that information accessible for future generations so that they don't have to piece together what you're piecing together now. That's my hope.
Piggybacking off of your thing, I see libraries as planting seeds. Like, for instance, you're talking about creating your own stories and preserving your own stories. There's the Oral History Collaborative that is going on now that the library has a part in, that other cultural institutions have, other nonprofits have right now, where we, all of the collaborative, offer the tools. Anyone can come in, you get the training on how to record oral histories. You can go out into your community and preserve those stories. And also, I'm not going to show for the library, but there are many other things that we have where, even your obsolete materials that you have, like your videotapes and stuff that you have sitting in a closet somewhere, the library, my ideal library, shows you how to preserve those things. How do you keep those things and you don't lose them? I'm even just thinking, the recent hurricanes that happen, so much gets lost. And I see that the libraries are a way, hopefully, I think we're starting to do that, and I hope we can continue to do that, plant those seeds to empower each other. There was something that I was thinking of that you were saying when you were talking, and about people that I was thinking of people that look like you. Like, my ideal library, it goes beyond. I think right now it's documented in the library industry that people of color and then women of color, there is a dearth of librarians that are representative of the population. So, like, my ideal library reflects demographically, also visually, way of thought, what that community is, and is planting those seeds.
I learned from some really brilliant, radical Black women librarians that library science is information management. And at this moment, we have so much information that we are managing. And so my hope and expectation for and interest in the future of librarianship is, for me, just tracking how these brilliant women of color are evolving the science of like how knowledge is produced and maintained and transmitted. And that looks like the Hand Games Project, and it looks like all of the work that the panelists are doing here. So for me, the future of librarianship and Black women's role in it is not unlike the past role of Black women in culture keeping and memory keeping.
I think like what I would love to have, it's not only like break the color line, because we already did, but the language. I know that at least like for my community, a lot of like Latinos go and they try to like integrate themselves into this country through the library, trying to like learn English, learn the language, learn the culture. But I would love for the library to be more open, for us to like be advocating to have more content with different languages. Understanding that America is not only English speaking, and is not only our melting pot, but this melting pot that needs to like continue keeping this culture in here and visible.
For me, the beauty of a library is a few things, but what stands out to me the most is resources and tangible goods. I always love to have a book in my hand versus reading something online. And I think to expand on resources, to piggyback off of what Dulcina said, I think that language is a big opportunity. But then in terms of tangible goods, I think the future of a library could consist of tangible goods outside of print, like even some of the things that Desiree is collecting in terms of a museum. And what if we could check out some of these items in addition to be able to hold and have for a short effect of checking out and returning, I think could be expanded on many other items. I would love to see that.
And there are public libraries that are doing or experimenting with that now. I mean, whether it's tool libraries where you can check out tools, to check out I think it's New York Public, that's like check out a person for their expertise. Like you get an hour with that person. So I think, yeah. I mean, and sorry. I know we gotta go, but I was just gonna say, oh, right. And right. I mean, we were checked out. Yeah, right, exactly. And as soon as I said it, I'm like, okay, to be clear, like, right, last time we were checked out, we weren't returned. We were returned. It's just an hour, and that's it. You come back. But yeah, I think that I'm glad you said that, because I agree that too. Like whether it's tools or expertise or something, I think that is also part of the future of libraries.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. Go ahead and get back here.
I experience this kind of exchange pretty much every day at Resource. People come in, people who don't know what the space is come in and assume that it's a bookstore. And they ask if they can buy books, and I say no, it's, a library, a non-traditional library, if you will. And the part of what Dulcina said about, like, if I take this book, then someone else won't have it, I think is something that I think about a lot in the space. And we do have a small retail component, but it's mostly goes back to the artist, and honestly wasn't original part of the plan for the space. It was meant to just be a library. And so I witness people coming into a space looking to buy something all the time, and then realizing that, like, the things that they came to buy, they cannot. And some people are disappointed, and then other people, I think it makes them think about the fact that if they buy this book, then someone who comes after them, they won't have to read it. And I think to answer your question, in the way that, we or I am playing part in this is to create a non-consumer space and to create a place where items are just there to be a resource, and then the person who comes after you will have that same resource that you have. But it's been very interesting for me to see how people react to that, because we live in a capitalist society and people assume that all spaces are consumer spaces. And even in using the word library, I had someone actually say to me when they wanted to buy a book and I said they're not for sale, they said, "Oh, I thought you just co-opted the term library for your bookstore." And I was I was blown away by that. That's been my experience.
So I've really negotiated my relationship with capitalism, and have spent a large part of my adulthood doing just that, because I identify as a business person in as much as I identify as a community organizer, activist, historian, and a community-centric, human-centric person. Business is intrinsic to our nature as human beings, so capitalism in itself, however flawed, is a part of the world that we exist in. And so, this idea of value exchange is one that perhaps I understand. I would want to understand your question, right? There is an opportunity for us to develop new systems of value exchange, but money in itself is not evil, right? So, like, the world moves around. We're each paid a salary, and most of us are able to exchange our time and expertise for money to live in this world and to pay a very expensive rent and cost of living in this very expensive city. And so the idea that money is not evil is one that I would like to potentially throw out, that we can all kind of explore and negotiate over the next couple of months, weeks, etc. But there are just other forms of value exchange that have been intrinsic to humankind for a very long time. I operated a collective of the found and forged vintage and antiques called Nomad Yard for 6 years, and it was a communal space. It was a collective. We functioned as an incubator. We supported 51 micro businesses and really provided a platform for distribution for those micro businesses, considering land was being privatized throughout the city. And in that space, I engaged with some of our customers in the art of bartering, and that was an element of accessibility that we had to exercise, because not every customer had money to spend on an item that they wanted. But there's always something that they have that we needed in store or that I sought value, and so I was willing to barter. And so this has been expressed in our daily lives, whether we're cognizant of it or not. Money is not the primary, the singular currency. And so it's just a matter of being able to kind of push that into our daily lives.
I think it's the way the library, working in the library space, by nature is, I think, counter to capitalism, because we're buying all these things and then you can get an infinite, well, not infinite, but near infinite amount of resources back. And I think one idea that's particularly interesting, and you bring up about how expensive space is in this city, how expensive space is. And I think even by having libraries and having that space that is free and accessible to all, something that we did have at MLK, and we will have when we reopen, because that is a lot of space, is we had a co-working space where people who had ideas had businesses ideas that could apply, and they don't pay money for space to work and to develop their ideas. The only thing that they give back is that they give back their time. So in exchange for having that space to develop your business or your idea, you share with other people what your expertise is. So I think that's where my work is providing space for whatever people need.
This was a tough question. It's super tough. It's a difficult question. I'm gonna steal your answer again. I think